What most people misunderstand about an empath's patience is that they think it runs out loudly. They imagine a breaking point, a slammed door, a raised voice, a dramatic exit. But that's not how it ends. Not for someone who has spent years absorbing other people's pain like it was their job to carry it. The final stage of an empath's patience is silent. It doesn't explode. It settles. It arrives quietly, almost peacefully, and that's exactly what makes it so dangerous to the people who relied on that patience for years. Here's what nobody tells you: an empath doesn't get tired of people. They get tired of explaining themselves to people who never intended to understand. They get tired of being the emotional translator in every relationship, the one who senses the unspoken tension in a room before anyone says a word, the one who forgives before the apology even comes. For years, this looks like strength. It looks like kindness. People call them so understanding, so patient, so easy to talk to. What they don't see is the quiet erosion happening underneath, the slow withdrawal of energy that nobody notices until it's gone. And here's the part that changes everything: empaths don't leave when they're angry. They leave when they're done feeling. That's the final stage, not rage, not resentment, detachment. A calm, almost eerie peace that comes from finally accepting that some people will never meet them halfway, no matter how much understanding is offered. This is the stage where the empath stops trying to be understood and starts protecting their own nervous system instead. It's not coldness, it's not revenge. It's the body and mind finally refusing to keep absorbing what was never theirs to carry in the first place. And the cruel irony: the people who pushed them to this point are often the last to notice it happened. Because the empath doesn't announce the shift. They just stop reaching. They stop explaining. They stop softening the truth to protect someone else's comfort. And by the time others notice the silence, it's not a phase. It's a decision. This is what we're going to break down today. The real psychology behind that final stage, why it happens, what it looks like from the inside, and why it's actually one of the healthiest things an empath can ever do for themselves. Somewhere along the way, society made a quiet agreement about empaths. It decided that because they feel deeply, they must also have an endless supply of patience to give, as if empathy works like a tap that never runs dry. As if the same heart that notices a stranger's sadness across a room, that picks up on the tension in someone's voice before they've said a single word, that absorbs grief and stress and worry like it's second nature, as if that heart is somehow immune to exhaustion. This is the first line nobody questions, and it's the one that quietly shapes everything that comes after. Think about how it usually starts. An empath is young, maybe a child, and they notice they're different in some way. They sense when their mother is upset before she says anything. They feel the shift in a room the moment someone walks in carrying invisible weight. And because they can feel it, they start trying to fix it. They comfort, they soften, they adjust themselves to match what the moment seems to need, and slowly, without ever choosing it consciously, they become the emotional regulator for everyone around them. The people around them notice this ability and, without realizing what they're doing, they start relying on it. A friend calls them at midnight every time because they know they'll listen. A family member vents for an hour, never once asking how the empath is doing, because the empath has never given them a reason to ask. A partner brings every frustration to them, every fear, every spiral, because the empath always seems to handle it. And the empath does handle it, every time. Without complaint, without asking for anything in return. This is where the myth takes root, because patience that is given consistently starts to look like patience that is unlimited. People stop seeing it as something the empath is choosing to offer. They start seeing it as something the empath simply is. A fixed trait, a permanent feature. Like the empath was built with a different operating system that doesn't experience fatigue the way everyone else does. But that's not true. It was never true. What looks like infinite patience is actually a series of conscious decisions made over and over again, often at a cost the empath doesn't fully register until much later. Every time they choose to stay calm instead of expressing frustration, every time they choose to understand instead of confront, every time they choose to absorb someone else's emotional mess instead of setting it down, that's energy being spent, real energy. The kind that doesn't regenerate just because nobody sees it being used. And here's where it gets dangerous, because the people benefiting from this pattern rarely think to ask if the empath is okay. Why would they? The empath has never shown cracks. They've never raised their voice. They've never said, I can't do this right now. So the assumption forms naturally, almost invisibly, this person can handle anything. This person doesn't get overwhelmed. This person is fine. Meanwhile, the empath is quietly absorbing more than their share in nearly every relationship they're part of. At work, they're the one colleagues vent to before bringing concerns to a manager. At home, they're the one who senses when something is wrong before anyone says it out loud. Among friends, they're the unofficial therapist, the peacekeeper, the one who remembers everyone's struggles and asks about them, even while their own struggles go unnoticed. This isn't sustainable. It was never designed to be. But because the empath has spent years being praised for their patience, called so mature, so understanding, such a good listener, they start to believe that this is simply who they are supposed to be. They start to feel guilty even imagining a version of themselves that says no, that protects their energy, that puts their own emotional needs first. And so the myth keeps feeding itself. The empath keeps giving. The people around them keep taking, often without any bad intention, simply because they've never been shown a reason to stop. Nobody is forced to confront the truth. Because on the surface, everything seems to be working. The empath is fine. The relationships continue. The pattern repeats. But underneath all of that smooth, uncomplaining patience, something is happening that nobody can see. A slow accumulation. A quiet tally being kept, even if the empath doesn't consciously realize they're keeping score. Every unspoken need. Every unreciprocated effort. Every moment they chose understanding over their own comfort. It doesn't disappear. It gathers. And that's the part the myth never accounts for. Patience isn't a personality trait that exists without limits. It's a resource. And like any resource, no matter how renewable it seems on the outside, it can be drained faster than it's replenished, until one day, the well that everyone assumed was bottomless simply isn't there anymore. Somewhere between childhood and adulthood, an empath learns a skill nobody teaches in school but everyone benefits from. They learn how to read a room before they even walk into it. They learn how to sense a shift in someone's tone, a change in body language, a pause that lasts half a second too long. And without ever being asked to, they start adjusting themselves to manage what they're sensing. This is where the real cost begins. Not in the big moments, not in the obvious crisis, in the small, constant, invisible act of absorbing what was never theirs to carry. Most people think empathy means understanding someone else's feelings. But for an empath, it goes further than that. It means actually taking those feelings in. Feeling the tightness in a friend's chest as if it were their own. Feeling the unspoken disappointment in a parent's silence as a weight settling into their own stomach. Empathy, for them, isn't observation, it's absorption. And absorption, unlike observation, has a cost that compounds over time. Picture someone walking into a room where tension is thick, even though nobody has said a word about it. Most people would feel a vague discomfort and move past it. An empath feels the discomfort and immediately starts working to resolve it, often without even deciding to. They soften their voice. They ask the right question. They offer the right comfort. They become, in that moment, a kind of emotional shock absorber for everyone else's unprocessed feelings. And they do this constantly in nearly every interaction, often without anyone noticing the effort it takes. This is the part nobody talks about, because from the outside it looks effortless. People assume the empath is simply good with people, that this is just who they are, a natural gift rather than a constant expenditure of energy. But every time they sense someone's stress and quietly absorb it, every time they pick up on unspoken sadness and carry it alongside their own, something is being used up. Emotional bandwidth isn't unlimited. It has a ceiling, and the empath is operating near that ceiling more often than anyone realizes, including often the empath themselves. What makes this even more dangerous is that the empath rarely gets the chance to set this weight down. Other people process their emotions and move on. The empath processes their own emotions and everyone else's, and rarely gets the space to release any of it. They become a kind of emotional storage unit, holding on to feelings that were never theirs to begin with, because nobody around them realizes they're even doing it. The empath doesn't announce, I'm carrying your sadness for you right now. They just do it quietly, automatically, until carrying becomes their default state, even in moments when nothing is technically being asked of them. Over time, this constant absorption starts to blur the line between what the empath actually feels and what they've picked up from everyone else. They start to lose track of their own emotional baseline. Are they anxious because something is wrong in their own life, or because they spent the last 3 hours with a friend who was anxious? Are they exhausted because of their own day, or because they spent it absorbing the stress of 3 different people who needed someone to lean on? This blurring is one of the most exhausting parts of being an empath, and almost nobody talks about it because it doesn't look like exhaustion from the outside. It looks like composure. And here's the deeper psychological toll. When someone spends years absorbing other people's emotional weight, they slowly start to lose touch with their own identity. Not because they don't have one, but because they've spent so much energy managing everyone else's inner world that there's little left to explore their own. They become experts at understanding what others need and strangers to what they themselves need. They can tell you exactly how a friend is feeling after one sentence, but they struggle to answer a simple question like, "How are you really?" This is the quiet erosion, not dramatic, not sudden. A slow wearing down of self, one absorbed emotion at a time. One unspoken need at a time, one moment of "I'm fine" when they weren't repeated for years. And because it happens so gradually, the empath often doesn't notice how much of themselves has been spent on everyone else until they're left staring at an emptiness they can't quite explain. That emptiness isn't weakness. It isn't failure. It's the natural result of giving something invisible over and over without ever replenishing it, and the body and mind eventually keep score even when no one else ever did. Every empath eventually arrives at a moment they didn't see coming, even though, looking back, it was building for years. It's not a dramatic moment. There's no single event that triggers it. It happens quietly in the middle of an ordinary day, when something small finally lands differently than it used to. A friend cancels plans last minute, again. A partner forgets something important, again. A family member calls only when they need something, again. And instead of the usual rush of understanding, instead of the automatic, "It's okay, I get it," something else happens. Nothing happens. A flatness. A stillness where the empathy used to be. This is the turning point, not anger, not a breakdown. A quiet internal shift where hope, which had been running the show for years, finally steps aside and lets acceptance take over. To understand why this moment matters so much, you have to understand what hope was actually doing for all those years. Every time an empath forgave too quickly, explained too patiently, or stayed too long in a draining situation, hope was underneath it. Hope that this time would be different. Hope that if they just kept showing understanding, the other person would eventually reciprocate. Hope that the relationship would balance itself out, that the effort would even out, that the same emotional labor they kept offering would someday be returned. Hope is what made the patience possible in the first place. Without it, none of the absorbing, none of the adjusting, none of the quiet sacrifices would have made sense. But hope, when it's repeatedly met with the same disappointing pattern, starts to wear thin in a very specific way. It doesn't disappear all at once. It erodes one disappointment at a time, the same way water slowly reshapes stone. And at some point, almost without the empath noticing exactly when it happened, hope quietly runs out of reasons to keep believing things will change. This is the moment acceptance steps in. And acceptance feels nothing like people expect it to feel. It's not relief. It's not freedom. At first, it feels like loss because in a way it is a loss. The empath is letting go of the version of the relationship they had been hoping for, the version where the other person finally understood them the way they understood everyone else. They're letting go of the story they had been telling themselves to justify the imbalance. And that letting go, even when necessary, even when healthy, still hurts. What makes this moment so often misunderstood by others is the contrast it creates. One day the empath is reachable, flexible, endlessly forgiving. Then, seemingly overnight, they're not. They stop offering the same level of explanation. They stop chasing understanding in conversations where understanding clearly isn't coming. They stop bending the way they used to bend. And the people around them who got used to that constant flexibility interpret this shift as the empath changing. As if something cold has replaced something warm. As if the empath has become distant or difficult or somehow less caring than before. But that's not what's happening. The empath hasn't become less caring. They've simply stopped directing all of their care outward while receiving none of it back. The shift isn't about losing empathy. It's about finally noticing how one-sided things had become and no longer being willing to pretend otherwise. This is also the moment where the empath stops over explaining themselves. For years, when something bothered them, they would explain their feelings carefully, gently, sometimes multiple times, hoping the other person would finally understand. After this shift, the explaining starts to fade. Not because the empath doesn't have the words anymore, but because they've finally realized that some people were never confused. They understood exactly how their actions affected the empath. They simply didn't change because they never had to. The empath always adjusted instead, and so the turning point isn't really about the other person at all. It's about the empath finally turning their attention toward their own reality instead of managing everyone else's. It's the moment they stop asking, "How can I make this easier for them?" and start asking, "Why have I never asked this question about myself?" This shift can look from the outside like the empath is becoming someone new. In truth, they're becoming someone honest. The patience that once flowed freely doesn't disappear because the empath stopped caring. It changes direction because hope finally ran out of evidence to support it, and acceptance walked in to take its place, quiet, clear, and undeniable. The strangest part of this stage is that it doesn't feel like what people expect detachment to feel like. There's no anger driving it, no desire for revenge, no dramatic confrontation where the empath finally says everything they've held back for years. Instead, there's a quiet pulling away that confuses everyone who witnesses it, including, at first, the empath themselves. Because detachment, when it finally happens for someone who has spent years absorbing everyone else's emotions, isn't coldness. It's the nervous system finally protecting itself after being left unprotected for far too long. To understand why this happens, you have to understand what the empath's body and mind have actually been doing all this time. Every time they absorbed someone's stress, every time they stayed calm in the middle of someone else's chaos, every time they offered patience instead of expressing their own frustration, their nervous system was working overtime. Not metaphorically, literally. The body responds to emotional labor the same way it responds to physical strain. It activates, it adjusts, it braces. And just like a muscle that's been overworked without rest, the nervous system eventually reaches a point where it simply cannot keep functioning the same way without breaking down. Detachment, in this context, isn't a personality change. It's a biological and psychological response to years of overextension. It's the mind recognizing, often before the empath consciously does, that the current pattern is unsustainable and quietly initiating a kind of self-protective shutdown in the areas where they've been bleeding energy the most. This is why it often looks so different from what people imagine when they hear the word detachment. It's not someone storming out of a relationship. It's someone slowly stopping themselves from absorbing every emotional cue the way they used to. It's someone hearing a friend vent and for the first time, not immediately taking on the weight of that venting as their own responsibility to fix. It's someone noticing tension in a room and, instead of automatically smoothing it over, simply letting it exist without stepping in. To others, this can look like indifference. In reality, it's the empath finally allowing themselves to stop absorbing what was never theirs to carry in the first place. This shift is often misread as selfishness, especially by people who had grown comfortable with the empath's constant emotional availability. When someone is used to being met with endless patience, even a small amount of distance feels jarring, even unfair to them. They might say things like, "You've changed," or "You used to be so understanding," without ever asking why that change happened. What they're really expressing is discomfort with no longer being the one who benefits from someone else's overextension. But here's the truth nobody likes to admit: Protecting your own mental and emotional health is not a betrayal of others. It's a basic requirement for being able to function at all. An empath who continues to give without limits doesn't become a better person for it. They become a depleted one. And a depleted person cannot offer real empathy, real patience, or real understanding to anyone, including themselves. Detachment, in this case, isn't the empath abandoning their compassion. It's the empath finally directing some of that compassion toward themselves instead of giving every last drop of it away. This is also where boundaries start to form, often for the first time in a real, sustainable way. Not boundaries built out of anger, but boundaries built out of necessity. The empath starts choosing which emotional weight they pick up and which they leave where it belongs. They start recognizing that someone else's bad mood is not automatically their responsibility to fix. They start understanding that listening to someone's struggles doesn't always require absorbing those struggles as their own. What makes this stage so psychologically powerful is the clarity it brings. For years, the empath operated from a place of obligation, often without realizing it. They gave because they didn't know how to do anything else. Detachment introduces choice into the equation for the first time. It allows them to ask, before instinctively absorbing someone's pain, is this mine to carry? And for the first time, the answer is sometimes simply no. This isn't coldness. It isn't the empath losing their empathetic nature. It's survival. It's the long overdue recognition that an empath who never protects their own energy eventually has none left to offer anyone, including the people they care about most. By the time an empath reaches this final stage, something fundamental has already shifted inside them, even if the outside world hasn't fully caught up yet. They haven't become harder. They haven't become distant for the sake of being distant. What's actually happened is much simpler and much more important. They've finally turned the same depth of attention they gave to everyone else back toward themselves. For years, their empathy moved in one direction, outward, toward friends who needed comfort, toward family members who needed patience, toward partners who needed understanding. Their entire emotional skill set was built around reading other people, anticipating other people's needs, softening other people's pain. And in all that giving, one person was consistently left out of the equation. Themselves. This final stage doesn't erase that skill. It redirects it. The empath who reaches this point doesn't suddenly become incapable of empathy. If anything, their empathy becomes sharper, more intentional, more aware of where it's going and why. The difference is that now, before extending that empathy outward, they pause and ask a question they never used to ask, what do I need right now? This single question, repeated enough times, starts to rebuild an entire relationship with themselves that years of outward giving had quietly neglected. This is where real boundaries take shape, not as walls meant to keep people out, but as a clearer sense of where the empath ends and where someone else's emotional responsibility begins. They start noticing the difference between supporting someone and rescuing them, between listening with care and absorbing someone's pain as their own, between offering patience and erasing their own needs to make space for someone else's. These distinctions, once invisible to them, become second nature, and with that clarity comes something they hadn't experienced in years, the ability to give without quietly losing themselves in the process. This shift also changes the kind of relationships they're willing to maintain. Where they once tolerated imbalance because they didn't know another way to exist, they now recognize it immediately. They notice when someone only reaches out in moments of crisis. They notice when their patience is being used as a convenience rather than appreciated as a gift. And instead of explaining themselves into exhaustion trying to fix that imbalance, they simply allow those relationships to find their natural level, often quieter, sometimes more distant, but far more honest. What's most powerful about this stage is the self-respect that emerges from it. For years, the empath's identity was built around being understanding, being patient, being the person who always showed up emotionally for others. That identity, while admirable, was incomplete because it left no room for the empath to receive the same care they so easily offered. This final stage completes that identity. It doesn't replace their empathy with indifference. It pairs their empathy with self-respect, creating someone who can still feel deeply for others while no longer disappearing in the process. This is why this stage, despite looking like withdrawal from the outside, is actually one of the healthiest transformations an empath can go through. It's not the end of their compassion. It's the beginning of compassion that finally includes themselves. And from this place, their relationships become more balanced, not because they've stopped caring, but because they've finally learned that caring for others was never supposed to come at the cost of abandoning themselves. In the end, the empath who reaches this final stage isn't someone who has lost their warmth. They're someone who has finally learned where that warmth needs to go first.